It was supposed to be a simple afternoon. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting its warm golden rays over the small, unremarkable cafe nestled in the heart of a sleepy neighborhood. The kind of place you'd pass by without a second thought, quiet, with faded tables, cracked porcelain cups, and the faint scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. A retreat from the world, a chance to breathe, to feel like everything was normal. Michelle Obama stepped in, her presence undeniable even in such an ordinary setting. Dressed casually, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she was a woman who could command attention in a room without even trying. She smiled politely at the barista behind the counter, her eyes scanning the space for an empty seat. There was a hum of low conversation, the murmur of local patrons lost in their own lives. For the briefest moment, it seemed like she could escape the weight of the world, if only for a few hours. She took a seat at a small table by the window, the soft clinking of silverware and cups barely breaking the stillness of the afternoon. Michelle settled in, leaning back in her chair, letting herself relax. The air felt cool, the noise outside barely a whisper. It was just her and the moment, nothing more. And then she saw her. The waitress. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with sharp features that didn't invite warmth. There was something about the way she moved, slightly too brisk, almost mechanical. Her eyes, cold and calculating, briefly met Michelle's, but there was no smile, no acknowledgement of the famous woman in front of her. Just a flash of something Michelle couldn't quite place, something that didn't belong in a place meant for comfort. As the waitress approached, Michelle stood, giving her a polite nod, expecting the usual pleasantries that came with a casual dining experience. But the response she got was far from ordinary. "What can I get you?" The waitress's voice was flat, no interest behind the words. Michelle, ever graceful, responded with a warm smile. "Just a coffee, please." The waitress didn't reply immediately. She looked at Michelle for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze lingering a fraction too long. It wasn't just indifference Michelle felt. It was something darker, something far less subtle. She returned to her station without another word, the air thick with unspoken tension. Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she tried to dismiss it. After all, she had been in hundreds of cafes, and not every interaction had to be perfect. She let the feeling slide away, focusing instead on the gentle hum of the cafe's ambience. Minutes passed, and Michelle's coffee arrived. The cup was placed in front of her with almost surgical precision, the waitress's eyes not meeting hers. But it wasn't just the lack of a smile that unsettled her. It was the slight flicker of something else in the waitress's gaze, something Michelle couldn't ignore. She picked up the cup, her fingers brushing the edge. She sipped. It was lukewarm, not fresh, not even close to what one would expect from a cafe known for its coffee. The bitterness hit her tongue, but it wasn't the taste that bothered her. It was the intention behind it. As Michelle glanced up from the cup, her eyes met the waitress's once more. This time, the look was unmistakable. There was contempt there, a sneer hidden just beneath the surface of the waitress's composed expression. It was a look Michelle had seen before, only rarely, and always in places she never expected. The quiet disdain of someone who thought they were better, who saw you not as a person, but as an object to be dismissed, an outsider. Michelle felt her body tense as the waitress turned away, moving to the other side of the cafe, but something inside her stirred. She had lived too many years in the public eye, facing far worse than this fleeting moment of unkindness. She had learned to let it go, to rise above it. But there was something about this encounter that felt different. It wasn't just the coldness in the waitress's eyes. It was the feeling that this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. The waitress would soon find out that Michelle Obama was not someone to be dismissed lightly, not by anyone. And as the seconds ticked by, Michelle's resolve began to harden. What she thought would be an ordinary afternoon was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. The game had just begun. Michelle sat still at her table, cradling her lukewarm coffee, The room felt smaller, the noise of the cafe suddenly louder, as if the world outside had suddenly started to encroach on her peaceful moment. Her fingers lingered on the rim of the cup, tracing the cracks in the ceramic that mirrored the tension she could now feel rising in her chest. The waitress had left, but the unease had not. Instead, it settled into the pit of her stomach, cold and unfamiliar. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't simply an offhand moment of bad service. It was something deeper. Michelle had encountered a lot in her life. As First Lady, she'd faced countless challenges, derogatory comments, invasive headlines, and petty criticisms. But this felt different. There was something about the waitress's dismissive attitude that grated against her, as if she wasn't seen as a person at all, but merely an object of ridicule. In those fleeting seconds, Michelle felt herself reduced to something less than human. Her mind raced, but she knew better than to react impulsively. She had lived her life in the public eye, had learned to navigate the most toxic of situations with grace, never allowing her composure to slip. But in this moment, something in her wanted to rise up, to do more than just sit there and let this woman's disdain wash over her like an invisible poison. The minutes passed. Michelle found herself staring out the window, watching the world go by outside. People moved in and out of view, oblivious to the storm brewing in the cafe. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every movement of the waitress, every flicker of her gaze, felt like a reminder that she was no longer in control of the space. The waitress was a shadow on her every thought. And then the door swung open, a bell tinkling above, and in walked another customer. The waitress, still behind the counter, gave no more than a brief nod to the newcomer. Michelle couldn't help but notice the difference in the way she greeted this new person. A warm smile, a few words exchanged. There was no coldness, no sense of superiority in her voice. It was as if Michelle didn't even exist. That was the moment Michelle realized it. The waitress hadn't just been rude to her, she had been deliberately hostile. The kind of hostility that came from a place of resentment, something older, deeper, more insidious than a simple bad mood. When the waitress finally returned to her table, she moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes not meeting Michelle's. She set the bill down with an almost theatrical flair, as if it were beneath her to even acknowledge the woman sitting across from her. Her lips barely parted when she spoke. "That'll be $5.50, she muttered, her tone flat, like she was doing Michelle a favor by even being there. Michelle looked up at her, her gaze steady. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment, this kind of disdain. But she wasn't going to let it slide either. This was more than just poor service. This was something else, something dangerous. "I think you owe me more than that," Michelle said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that seemed to resonate in the space between them. "You can start by acknowledging me as a person, not just as someone to be dismissed." The waitress didn't react immediately. She stood there, her expression hardening, but not in surprise. There was no flicker of realization, no apology. Instead, she just looked down at Michelle with an unreadable expression, her posture stiff. There was no warmth in her eyes, only the sharpness of someone who had already made up their mind about who Michelle was and what she deserved. "You're not my type," the waitress said, her words dripping with thinly veiled contempt. "So don't expect special treatment." Michelle's heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but because she could hear the undertone of racism in the waitress's words. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The casual dismissal of her presence, the arrogance in the waitress's voice as though she held the power to decide who was worthy of respect. It wasn't about the coffee. It wasn't about the bill. It was about something much darker. The waitress's disregard for Michelle's humanity, her sheer audacity in reducing Michelle to something less than herself, was rooted in something that Michelle had encountered before, but never so openly. "Let's get this straight," Michelle said, her tone now firm, sharp. "You don't get to decide who's worthy of respect. We all deserve the same treatment. I'm not asking for anything extraordinary. Just the same decency you show everyone else in this cafe." The waitress shifted uncomfortably, but there was no apology in her gaze. Instead, she leaned closer, the malice in her eyes now more pronounced. "You think you're so special," she sneered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just because you're famous doesn't mean you can get away with whatever you want. People like you—" The rest of the sentence hung in the air like an accusation, sharp and loaded with meaning that Michelle didn't need to hear to understand. It was clear now. This wasn't just about service. It wasn't just about a bad attitude. It was about the deep-seated prejudices that had shaped this waitress's view of the world and of Michelle. The waitress took a step back, her eyes flashing with disdain, and turned on her heel to walk away, but not before she cast one last glance over her shoulder, as if to say, "You don't belong here, and I'm not sorry about it." Michelle sat there, frozen in place for a moment. A part of her wanted to lash out, to demand an apology, to make this woman realize the gravity of what she had said. But Michelle had been in the public eye long enough to know how such things played out. She had learned to fight with dignity, not anger, and yet, in this moment, she felt something stir inside her, a deep, unyielding anger that had nothing to do with personal pride. It was about something bigger, about the deep-rooted systemic hatred that people like the waitress carried with them, often unseen, often ignored. The waitress returned to the back of the cafe, and Michelle felt the weight of the silence settle over her. The other patrons were oblivious to the tension that had just unfolded, lost in their own worlds. But Michelle wasn't the same woman who had walked in just an hour ago. She knew something had shifted. The moment was no longer just about bad service. It was about something that could no longer be brushed aside. As the waitress disappeared into the back, Michelle made a decision. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let this woman's hostility go unnoticed. She had the power to speak out, to bring attention to what was happening, to shed light on the kind of ugliness that people often tried to ignore. But she wasn't going to do it with anger. No, Michelle would make sure the truth of what had happened would be known. She would be patient. She would let it unfold in its own time. The waitress had just made a mistake she would come to regret more than she could ever imagine. But for now, Michelle stood up, paid the bill, and walked out of the cafe. As the door closed behind her, she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew this was far from over. It was only just beginning. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced anything similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts with us, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories. Now, let's continue. Michelle's heart pounded as she stepped out of the cafe. The door closed behind her with a soft chime, leaving the noise and tension behind. But the impact of the interaction lingered, settling deep inside her, like an unwanted echo. She had faced much worse in her life: racism, cruelty, the whispers of those who thought they could define her. But what had just happened in that cafe was different. It wasn't just the cold, calculated rudeness of the waitress. It was something more personal, a targeted assault on her identity. She walked slowly down the street, her mind racing, her steps deliberate. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement. Despite the warmth of the afternoon, Michelle felt chilled. Her experience in the cafe was not a one-off incident. It was the kind of behavior that had woven itself into the fabric of society, a deep-seated hatred that many chose to ignore. It had been there, lurking in the quiet moments, in the glances that people gave her, in the words they didn't say out loud but spoke with their eyes. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, but Michelle wasn't the type to back down. She had been through too much to let something as insignificant as one person's disdain control her. But that didn't mean it was easy to shake off. The words the waitress had spoken still reverberated in her mind. "You're not my type." That phrase haunted her. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a proclamation of power. The waitress had made it clear that she felt entitled to decide who was worthy of respect, who deserved kindness, and who didn't. Michelle wasn't sure if it was the racism that cut the deepest or the arrogance in the waitress's tone. But whatever it was, it lingered, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. As Michelle walked, she reminded herself of who she was. A woman who had lived through unimaginable challenges, a woman who had risen above hate and ignorance. But there was still a part of her that burned with frustration. The world hadn't changed as much as she hoped it would. In fact, it felt as though things had only grown worse, more divisive, more cruel. She stopped at the corner of the street, staring out at the people bustling past her, oblivious to her presence, oblivious to the small, daily battles that people like her faced. They walked by without a glance, lost in their own worlds. But Michelle couldn't help but wonder how many of them, if they were to stop for a moment and look deeper, would see the quiet cruelty that simmered beneath the surface of society. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message. It was from a friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in a while. She unlocked the phone and read the text. "Hey, I saw what happened earlier today. Are you okay?" The text sent a pang of warmth through her chest. It was a reminder that not everyone was blind to the ugliness that existed in the world. She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered how to respond. What could she say? That she was fine? That it didn't matter? Instead, she typed out a response. "I'm fine. Just tired." She sent the message before she could think better of it. She didn't want to burden her friends with the weight of her frustrations. Not this time. This time, she had to handle it herself. As Michelle continued walking, she couldn't shake the thought of the waitress. The woman had crossed a line that most people wouldn't dare to. She had made it clear that she saw Michelle as less than human, as though her presence in that cafe, in that space, was somehow unwelcome. But there was something else, something deeper, that troubled Michelle. It wasn't just the waitress. It was the fact that, for all the progress that had been made in the world, this kind of hatred still existed. It was hidden behind polite smiles and veiled words, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface of everyday life, and it was impossible to ignore. The more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. It wasn't just the personal insult. It was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. This kind of prejudice was everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in the streets. It was in the way people looked at her when they didn't think she was watching. It was in the way they assumed she didn't belong. But Michelle wasn't going to let that define her. She wasn't going to let the actions of one waitress, or anyone else for that matter, make her feel less than she was. She had fought too hard for that. She had fought too hard for her voice, for her space, for her identity. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the day. The waitress's words echoed in her ears, but she didn't let them control her. She had been through too much to be taken down by a single encounter. She had faced bigger battles, and she had won them. This was just another fight, a fight that wasn't over yet. The next day, Michelle returned to the cafe. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was to confront the waitress, to demand an apology. Maybe it was to prove something to herself, but as she stepped through the door, she was ready for whatever would come. The waitress was behind the counter, her back to Michelle as she wiped down the surface. When she heard the door chime open, she turned, her eyes narrowing as they locked onto Michelle's. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Michelle didn't flinch. She stood tall, meeting the waitress's gaze without hesitation. The woman's face was hard, defensive, as though she were preparing for a confrontation. But Michelle didn't come here to fight, not in the way the waitress expected. "I wanted to talk," Michelle said, her voice steady but firm. The waitress raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Michelle took a deep breath. "About respect. About humanity. About the way you spoke to me yesterday." The waitress rolled her eyes, as if Michelle were just another nuisance. "I don't have time for this." But Michelle wasn't deterred. "I think you owe me an apology." she said, her voice unwavering. Not just because I'm Michelle Obama, but because I'm a person who deserves the same respect you give to anyone else who walks through that door. The waitress's eyes flickered with something, regret, embarrassment. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. She crossed her arms over her chest and scoffed. You think you're entitled to special treatment because of who you are? Michelle shook her head. I don't expect special treatment. I expect basic decency, something I'm sure you'd show anyone else who came in here. There was a tense silence, and for a moment, Michelle thought the conversation would end there. But then, the waitress dropped her arms, her expression softening ever so slightly. I'm sorry, she muttered, almost inaudibly. I was out of line. It wasn't the apology Michelle had hoped for, but it was something. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. Michelle nodded, turning to leave. As she stepped out of the cafe, she felt a strange sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But in that moment, she knew she had made a difference, even if it was just for one person. Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. The cafe, once a place of solace, had now become a symbol of something much darker. The waitress's apology had been brief, forced, but it had left an unsettling echo in Michelle's mind. She had hoped for more, hoped that her confrontation would inspire some kind of epiphany in the woman, or at the very least, create a crack in the hardened wall of indifference. But there was no epiphany, no immediate change, just a thin veneer of civility, a fragile truce that, Michelle feared, would soon erode back into the quiet prejudice that seemed so embedded in the world around her. As Michelle left the cafe, her thoughts weighed heavy on her. The world was full of these small battles, these moments of everyday cruelty that many chose to overlook. She couldn't ignore them anymore, not when she had felt the sting of it so personally. Racism was no longer just something she read about in the news or heard discussed in hushed tones. It was something visceral, something real, something that could hit her in the most unexpected places. The waitress's words had carried a weight far greater than any insult she had faced before. It was an open declaration of contempt, not just for Michelle, but for anyone who dared to challenge the established order. That evening, as Michelle sat in her apartment, alone with her thoughts, she found herself reflecting on her journey. The years of work, of advocacy, of pushing against systems that seemed determined to crush the dreams of those who were different, had all led her to this point. But despite the strides she had made, despite the small victories, the fight for equality and respect seemed endless. For every inch gained, there were miles still to go. But what troubled Michelle more than anything was the sense that the fight was evolving, becoming more insidious, more hidden behind polite smiles and civil conversations. The waitress, like so many others, would never speak openly about the racism she harbored. It wasn't the loud, aggressive racism that people often thought of, the kind that made headlines or led to protests. No, this was the quiet kind. The kind that made you feel small without saying a word. The kind that made you question your worth in a world that should have already known. Michelle knew she couldn't let it go. She couldn't allow herself to remain passive in the face of this kind of hate. She had seen too much of it, felt it too many times, to let it slide under the radar. But what could she do? What could she say to someone who wouldn't even acknowledge the hate within them? The next morning, Michelle found herself back at the cafe. The thought of walking through the door again filled her with a strange mix of apprehension and determination. She had to confront the situation. She had to see whether her initial reaction had been right, whether there was more beneath the surface. And she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished. She wasn't looking for closure, but she was looking for something more than an apology that had felt hollow, empty. She wanted to understand. As she stepped inside the cafe, the bell above the door chimed again. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries filled the air, but this time, the warmth of the place didn't feel inviting. The chatter of the customers, the clink of cups, all seemed distant, as if she had crossed into a different world. She felt, for the first time, like an outsider. She scanned the room, and there she was, the waitress behind the counter, wiping down the surface with robotic precision. When the waitress saw Michelle, her face tightened, and for a moment, it looked as if she were preparing to retreat. But Michelle was not going to back down this time. She approached the counter slowly, her heels clicking against the floor, her posture straight and commanding. The waitress didn't look up, her hands still moving mechanically, as if trying to avoid eye contact. It wasn't the coldness of her demeanor that stung the most, it was the subtle way she avoided acknowledging Michelle, as if pretending she weren't there would make everything go away. Michelle cleared her throat, and the waitress froze. Without lifting her gaze, the woman spoke. "What do you want?" Her voice had a slight edge to it, a hardness that Michelle hadn't heard before. "I just want to talk," Michelle replied, her voice calm but firm. "About what happened yesterday." The waitress's eyes flickered up for the briefest of moments, but she didn't say anything. She just continued wiping the counter with exaggerated slowness. Michelle felt a pang of frustration bubble up inside her. This was not how she wanted this to go. She didn't want to stand here, trying to break through a wall that was so stubbornly entrenched. "You don't get it, do you?" Michelle continued, her voice rising just enough to make the waitress look up at her fully. "This is about respect. You don't just get to decide who deserves it and who doesn't." The waitress finally met Michelle's gaze, and for a moment, the hostility in her eyes was unmistakable. "I don't have time for this," she snapped, her tone venomous. "People like you think you can walk in here and—" Michelle's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let the words take root. She knew what was coming next. "People like me?" she asked, her voice quieter now but sharp. "What exactly does that mean?" The waitress shifted uncomfortably, her posture defensive, but Michelle wasn't letting her off the hook this time. She had to understand. She needed to hear it from her. "You think just because you're a celebrity or whatever, you get special treatment? You think just because you were First Lady, you're somehow above everyone else?" The waitress's voice was shaking now, but Michelle could see the contempt still lurking behind her words. "You people, you all come in here, expecting us to bow down to you, to treat you like you're above us, like you're better than us." Michelle's heart clenched. She had heard these words before, but hearing them spoken with such raw animosity, such blatant hatred, stung more than she had anticipated. It was not just racism anymore. It was resentment, pure and simple, and it wasn't just about Michelle. It was about everything that had built up inside this woman, everything she had been taught to believe, everything she had internalized. The waitress saw Michelle as a symbol of something she could never attain, and that hatred had festered inside her for so long that it had turned into venom. "No," Michelle said, her voice steady despite the hurt she felt. "This isn't about me being above anyone else. This is about human decency, about basic respect for another person. This isn't about fame or status or any of those things you think matter. It's about seeing people for who they are, not what you want them to be." The waitress's face twisted into a sneer. "I see you for what you are," she spat. "Just another one of them. Another person who thinks they can get away with whatever they want, just because of who they are. You think you can just walk in here, make demands, get your way." Michelle's stomach churned, but she held her ground. "You're wrong," she said. "I'm not making demands. I'm asking for respect. The same respect you would give to anyone else who walked through that door. You don't get to decide who deserves that respect. We all do." The waitress looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she broke eye contact, turning back to the counter. "I don't have time for this," she repeated, her voice softer now, but still laced with contempt. Michelle took a step back, her heart heavy with a mixture of disappointment and frustration. The conversation had ended, not with any clarity or understanding, but with the same coldness that had marked their first interaction. The waitress had made it clear that she wasn't ready to confront her own biases, wasn't ready to see Michelle for the person she was. And maybe, just maybe, that was something Michelle couldn't change. But that didn't mean she wasn't going to try. As Michelle walked out of the cafe, she didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel defeated either. She just felt tired. The fight for respect, for basic decency, was far from over. It wasn't going to be won in a single conversation or in one small act of defiance. It was going to take time, and it would require more than just her. But she would keep fighting, one step at a time, because that's what she had always done. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Michelle woke up to the same morning sun filtering through her window, but the feeling she had carried with her since the cafe encounter lingered like a fog. It was a fog she couldn't shake, a weight pressing against her chest that she couldn't ignore. She had tried to push it aside, to convince herself that she had handled the situation well, that she had said all the right things, but the truth was, something about the way the waitress had looked at her, the venom that dripped from her words, had cracked something deep inside Michelle. It wasn't the words themselves. She had heard far worse in her life. It was the knowing that this hatred existed in places she couldn't always see. It was the realization that it wasn't just the waitress. This was a part of the world Michelle had worked so hard to change. And it was alive, festering in the quiet corners of society. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to find the strength she had always carried. She had fought too long, had risen too high to let something like this bring her down. And yet, there was a bitterness in her heart that refused to leave. The woman had shown no remorse, no understanding. It was as if her racism was so ingrained, so deeply rooted in the fabric of her being, that she didn't even recognize it for what it was. But Michelle saw it clearly, and that was what troubled her the most. How this woman didn't see it, how she couldn't understand the pain she was causing. The day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and the routine that had become her life after leaving the White House. But despite the bustle around her, the encounter still gnawed at her, pulling her into a space she didn't want to be in. As the day wore on, Michelle found herself pacing, her thoughts racing. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much this encounter had affected her, how much it was tied to a larger narrative, one that she had been trying to confront for years. But how could she fight against something so insidious, so deeply embedded in the fabric of society? Racism wasn't always loud. It wasn't always in your face. It was the quiet looks, the whispered comments, the deliberate avoidance of acknowledgement. It was the way people assumed you didn't belong, simply because of the color of your skin. Michelle knew that as well as anyone. She had lived it her entire life, but to see it, to feel it, in such an intimate, personal way, it was different. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, Michelle thought back to the one thing the waitress had said that had stuck with her. People like you. The phrase haunted her, echoed in her mind, like a constant reminder of the boundaries people sought to create. People like Michelle, black, successful, educated, a public figure, didn't belong in spaces like that cafe. That was the underlying message. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to be in the same world as those who believed they were entitled to more. The waitress had made it clear. People like Michelle weren't meant to be seen as equals. The anger began to build in Michelle's chest again, and this time, it wasn't something she could just brush off. She had fought for years, using her platform to advocate for justice, for equality, for understanding. But every day, it seemed like the fight only became harder. Racism wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was something that had to be faced head-on, over and over again. It wasn't enough to simply exist in a space anymore. She had to challenge it. She had to show people like the waitress that the world wasn't theirs to define. The next day, Michelle returned to the cafe. She didn't want to, but she knew she had to. There was a deeper sense of urgency now, a need to confront the situation that she couldn't ignore. She couldn't let this one moment fester in her mind. She couldn't let that waitress's actions define how she saw the world. But she couldn't walk away from it either. This wasn't just about one woman's prejudice. It was about the larger system that allowed it to thrive, unchecked. As she walked into the cafe again, the bell above the door chimed, and the familiar scent of coffee and baked goods filled her senses. The room seemed different this time, more suffocating, more oppressive. She scanned the room, and once again, her eyes landed on the waitress behind the counter. The woman was busy, moving with a sense of purpose, but when she looked up and saw Michelle, her face tightened. The waitress's expression flickered with something that resembled guilt, but just as quickly, it was replaced by the same cold, dismissive look she had given Michelle before. Michelle took a deep breath and walked up to the counter, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She stood for a moment, waiting for the waitress to acknowledge her, but the woman continued wiping the counter, pretending she didn't see her. It was as if she were hoping Michelle would just leave, hoping she wouldn't confront her again. But Michelle wasn't going anywhere. "Yesterday," Michelle began, her voice calm but firm, "you said some things to me that I don't think you fully understand. Things that go beyond just bad service. Things that go beyond just being rude." The waitress's eyes flickered up briefly, but she quickly looked away. She was clearly uncomfortable, but Michelle wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. "You can ignore me all you want," Michelle continued, her tone unwavering. "But I won't ignore what you said, and I won't let you get away with it, not without understanding why it matters." The waitress took a step back, her face hardening. "I didn't mean anything by it," she muttered, her voice tight. "I was just frustrated. It wasn't about you." Michelle's gaze never wavered. "No, it was about me. It was about me, and it was about every other person who walks into this cafe, who looks different, who doesn't fit into your narrow view of who belongs here. It was about race, whether you want to admit it or not." The waitress's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. Michelle could see her struggling, wrestling with her own discomfort, but the walls were still up. The woman wasn't ready to confront what she had said, wasn't ready to own her actions. "You don't get to decide who belongs in this world," Michelle said, her voice low but strong. "Not because you don't like them, not because you think they don't fit your idea of what's acceptable. People like you," she paused for a moment, leaning in just slightly, "have been making those decisions for far too long, and it's time for it to stop." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in the waitress's eyes, something that resembled fear, or maybe just recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same stubborn defensiveness. "I didn't do anything wrong," the waitress snapped, her tone rising now, trying to reclaim control of the situation. Michelle took a step back, shaking her head slightly. "You don't see it, do you?" she asked, more to herself than to the waitress. "You don't see the harm in what you said, in how you treated me. But that's the problem. People like you have been saying these things for years, and no one's called you out on it. No one's told you that this behavior is unacceptable." There was a long silence, thick and uncomfortable. Michelle's eyes never left the waitress's, her resolve steady. She wasn't backing down. Not this time. Finally, the waitress looked at her again, but this time there was a crack in her facade. The woman opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. She was searching for something, trying to find a way to make it right, or at least to salvage some sense of dignity from the situation. "I'm sorry," she muttered, the words almost drowned out by the clattering of dishes in the background. Michelle nodded, her expression softening just slightly. It wasn't much. It wasn't the grand gesture of understanding she had hoped for, but it was a start. A small, almost imperceptible start, but it was something. "You don't have to apologize to me," Michelle said, her voice gentler now. "But you do need to understand what you've done. And you need to start thinking about how your actions, your words, affect others." With that, Michelle turned and walked out of the cafe, her heart still heavy but resolute. The world wouldn't change overnight. She knew that. It was a long, slow fight. But this was one battle, one moment in time that she could shape, and she had done it. Confronted the hate, faced the ignorance, and walked away knowing that, for once, she hadn't been silenced. Michelle's footsteps echoed in the silent streets as she walked away from the cafe. The cool breeze of the evening seemed to offer some reprieve from the heaviness that lingered in her chest, but it wasn't enough. The confrontation had not been what she expected. There was no grand moment of understanding or reconciliation. Instead, there was just a cold apology, so rushed, so insincere, that it left her wondering if anything had changed at all. She had confronted the waitress, but the woman's indifference had been more painful than any overt insult. As she walked, Michelle couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in her mind. Every word, every pause, every flicker of hesitation from the waitress. What had been accomplished? Had she made a difference? Or had she just wasted her time trying to get through to someone who wasn't ready to see her as an equal? The sense of frustration only deepened the more she thought about it. The waitress's apology had been half-hearted, a quick attempt to absolve herself, to ease the tension without understanding what had really happened. And in a way, Michelle realized, that was the real problem. The world around her had become so accustomed to sweeping issues like racism under the rug, to pretending that we've come so far that people didn't even see it anymore. It was easier to pretend it wasn't there, easier to go on with their lives and tell themselves that they were doing their part by simply being polite. But politeness wasn't enough. Not anymore. She had felt it herself, the subtle, insidious ways racism worked its way into everyday life. It wasn't just in the overt hate speech or violent actions. It wasn't always the ugly slurs or the loud public displays of contempt. No, racism had evolved into something quieter, something more dangerous. It was in the look people gave you when they thought you weren't paying attention, the way they automatically assumed you didn't belong, the way they turned a blind eye when you needed help. It was the systemic inequality woven into the very fabric of society, and it was something Michelle knew she couldn't simply ignore. Not anymore. The next morning, as Michelle sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let that moment fade into the background. She wasn't going to let that waitress's indifference be the last word on the matter. Michelle had spent her entire life fighting for something more than just a place at the table, more than just a seat in the room. She had fought for equality, for justice, for the recognition of the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of the color of their skin. But the fight wasn't over. It was far from over. The day passed in a blur, but Michelle couldn't focus on her usual tasks. Her thoughts kept returning to the cafe, to the encounter with the waitress, to the realization that this battle wasn't something she could win in a single moment. It was something that would require constant vigilance, constant action, and most importantly, it was something that needed to be confronted in every corner of society, whether it was in a cafe, a boardroom, or a classroom. That night, as Michelle sat in front of her computer, the weight of the day seemed to settle on her shoulders. She opened up a blank document and began to write. She wrote about the encounter, about the subtle racism that still pervaded so much of society. She wrote about the need for people to see the world as it truly was, not through the rose-colored glasses of privilege, but through the eyes of those who had been marginalized for far too long. She wrote for hours, pouring her thoughts onto the page, her frustration and anger mixing with the deep sense of responsibility she felt. This was her fight. This was her purpose. She couldn't change the world by sitting back and hoping that things would get better. She had to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep speaking the truth even when it was uncomfortable. As she wrote, the words began to flow more easily. She wrote about her own experiences with racism, the subtle glances, the whispers, the feeling of always being an outsider in spaces where she should have belonged. She wrote about the times she had been told she was too much or not enough, simply because of the color of her skin, and she wrote about the countless others who had experienced the same thing, who had been forced to carry the invisible chains of prejudice and discrimination every day. By the time she finished, it was well past midnight. She sat back, staring at the words on the screen, feeling a sense of catharsis wash over her. This was her truth. This was the reality that so many people didn't want to face. And it was time for the world to hear it. Michelle knew that writing the words wasn't enough. She couldn't just leave it there, buried in a document on her computer. She needed to take action. She needed to get people to listen. The next day, she sent an email to her publicist, outlining her plan. She was going to write an op-ed, a call to action that would speak directly to the heart of the issue. She wanted people to understand the gravity of what had happened in the cafe, to see that this wasn't just a small, isolated incident. It was a reflection of something far larger, something that needed to be confronted head-on. The following week, Michelle's op-ed was published. It was a raw, unflinching look at the racism that still permeated every aspect of society. It wasn't about the waitress anymore. It was about the broader culture of prejudice and inequality that existed everywhere, from small cafes to the halls of power. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truths that people so often tried to ignore. The response was overwhelming. The op-ed went viral, spreading across social media and news outlets. People from all walks of life reached out to Michelle, sharing their own stories of racism and discrimination. Some were supportive, some were critical, but all of them were engaged in the conversation. It was a start, and that was all Michelle needed. But there were others, those who refused to see the problem, who denied the reality that Michelle was trying to expose. They called her angry, divisive, even ungrateful. They dismissed her words as the rants of someone who had forgotten where she came from. But Michelle didn't let their words deter her. She had faced much worse, and she wasn't going to stop now. The backlash was predictable. People who didn't want to acknowledge their own biases would always find a way to attack those who spoke out. But Michelle had learned long ago not to let the voices of hate drown out the voices of hope. She had seen it before, the same tired arguments, the same old defenses of a system that kept people in their place. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. As the weeks passed, Michelle continued to speak out. She gave interviews, wrote more articles, and met with people who were working on the front lines of the fight for racial justice. She worked with activists, educators, and community leaders, all of whom shared her vision for a world that was truly equal. And she continued to confront the issue in every space she entered, challenging people to see the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. The waitress, meanwhile, had become a distant memory. Michelle had no illusions about whether the woman had truly changed. She had apologized, but Michelle knew that real change required more than just a few words. It required a fundamental shift in how people saw each other, how they saw the world, and that was the work that needed to be done. One evening, several months later, Michelle received a message from a woman who had been a regular customer at the cafe. She had been following the conversation online, and she had a message for Michelle. "I just wanted to let you know, I spoke to the waitress. She came to me, apologized for her behavior, and said she had been thinking a lot about what you said. She said you were right about the way people like her are conditioned to see the world. She said she was going to try to do better." It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a small step in the right direction. Michelle smiled as she read the message, knowing that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, she knew that the seeds of change had been planted. And no matter how long it took, she would keep fighting until those seeds grew into something real. The world wasn't perfect, but Michelle was determined to make it better. One step at a time. One conversation at a time. The weeks that followed Michelle's op-ed were filled with a whirlwind of emotions. The public's reaction to her words was a mixed bag of support and harsh criticism. Some people saw her piece as a bold call for justice, an unapologetic demand for change. They praised her for having the courage to speak out against the pervasive, hidden nature of racism. Others, however, found her words inflammatory, divisive, and unnecessary. The backlash wasn't just predictable, it was vicious. Social media was a battleground. The more Michelle's piece gained traction, the more the hate poured in. She was called everything from an angry woman to a race baiter, and every argument against her seemed to draw from the same tired narrative. She was accused of stirring up conflict where there was none, of using her fame to push an agenda that didn't reflect the realities of most people's lives. But the one label that stung the most was the accusation that she was too sensitive, as if racism was something that could simply be ignored, as if her experiences were nothing more than the complaints of someone who was privileged enough to not see the bigger picture. Michelle knew better than to let the vitriol affect her. She had faced much worse during her time as First Lady, and she had learned to keep a stoic face in the face of overwhelming public scrutiny. But the harsh words weren't easy to shake off. They didn't just criticize her, they trivialized her lived experience. They mocked the pain of countless people who had been victims of the same subtle racism she had faced. And worse, they perpetuated the same systems of inequality she was fighting so hard to dismantle. The cafe incident was no longer just a personal affront. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the world. The waitress's refusal to understand her actions had mirrored the larger societal problem. Too many people were unwilling to see the truth. Too many were comfortable in their ignorance. And too many were invested in keeping things the way they were. Michelle had spoken up, but she had also become a target. Her critics were loud, angry, and determined to silence her. It wasn't just strangers who were criticizing her. The backlash also came from people she had known for years, some of whom were former colleagues and acquaintances. There were murmurs in the circles she moved in, casual comments about how Michelle had lost her way, or how she was being too confrontational. The whispers made her feel isolated in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had spent her career navigating a delicate dance of diplomacy, of trying to please people while still advocating for what she believed was right. But now, it felt as if those who once supported her had turned their backs. One night, after a particularly heated interview where her stance was called reckless, Michelle sat alone in her apartment, a glass of wine in her hand. She hadn't been able to focus on much since the article's publication. The swirling noise of the internet, the phone calls, the messages, they all weighed on her. Despite all the praise and support, the criticism felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the horizon, but her mind was far from the view in front of her. The weight of the responsibility she had taken on seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Had she been too outspoken? Had she gone too far in calling out the system? Her mind wavered, the thoughts pressing in on her. But then something inside her snapped back into focus. She thought of the waitress, the one who had so casually dismissed her, who had reduced her to a stereotype, to an outsider in a space she had every right to occupy. She thought of the countless others like her who were constantly subjected to that kind of dismissal, to that silent racism that pervaded every level of society. She thought of her own experiences growing up, the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, that she was too much, that she didn't belong. This wasn't about one person. It wasn't about a single cafe encounter. This was about something larger, more insidious, that needed to be confronted head-on. If she backed down now, if she let the noise of the critics drown her out, then she would have lost the fight before it even began. She couldn't afford to lose, not when there were so many others who had been fighting for far longer, whose voices were still being ignored. The next morning, Michelle got up early and went for a run. The cool air hit her face as she stepped outside, the rhythmic pounding of her feet on the pavement a grounding force. She needed clarity, needed space to think. As she ran, she found herself reflecting on the many moments in her life when she had been told to stay quiet, when she had been told that speaking out was too much, that her anger wasn't justified. The world, it seemed, was always telling her to calm down, to be more palatable, to be more composed. But that's the problem, she realized. The world didn't want to hear the truth. It didn't want to hear the anger that came from years of being told you weren't enough, from years of being pushed to the margins. But Michelle knew she couldn't silence herself. She couldn't play it safe anymore. The next day, she gave another interview. This time, it was for a major news network. She had been asked to speak about her op-ed, about the growing conversation around race and privilege. But this time, Michelle wasn't going to play the role of the composed, diplomatic former First Lady. This time, she was going to speak from the heart. The interview began innocuously enough, with the host asking her about her piece and how it had resonated with so many people. But the moment Michelle was asked to address the criticisms about being too angry, about causing division, her demeanor shifted. "It's not anger," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's frustration. It's frustration with a system that continues to deny the very existence of the struggles that people like me face every single day. It's frustration with a society that looks the other way when its own people are being mistreated. And yes, it's frustration with the fact that we've come so far, yet we still have so much further to go." The host tried to interject, asking about the specifics of her critique, but Michelle wasn't having it. "What's the point of talking about racism if we can't even acknowledge that it exists? What's the point of having a conversation about change if we're too afraid to confront the systems of privilege that hold so many people back? If the truth is uncomfortable, then let's sit with that discomfort. Let's talk about it until we can't ignore it anymore." The host was quiet for a moment, taken aback by her bluntness. The studio was silent, and Michelle could feel the weight of every word. This was no longer just about defending her stance. This was about drawing a line in the sand, about making it clear that she wasn't going to play by anyone's rules but her own. "I've spent my entire life navigating spaces where people like me are told to shrink, to make themselves smaller, to make others feel comfortable," Michelle continued. "But what happens when you've been shrinking for so long that you forget who you are? What happens when you stop asking for the space you deserve? You become invisible, and that's the real problem here. People don't see us. They don't hear us." There was a long pause, and Michelle could see the shift in the room. It wasn't just the host who was listening. She could feel the weight of the moment in the room, in the quiet that had settled over the audience. "What do you want people to take away from all of this?" the host asked after a long moment. Michelle took a deep breath. "I want people to understand that this fight isn't over. I want people to realize that just because we've made progress, just because we've come a long way, it doesn't mean the work is done. There's still so much left to do. And if we're not talking about it, if we're not confronting it, then we're just letting it persist in the shadows, in the quiet places where people think no one's looking." The interview ended shortly after, and Michelle left the studio feeling a mix of exhaustion and empowerment. The conversation wasn't over, and neither was the fight. She had spoken her truth, loud and clear, and while the world wasn't ready to hear it, she knew it needed to be said. As she made her way home, Michelle felt a sense of resolve she hadn't felt before. The battle was far from over. The resistance, the backlash, it was all part of the process. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready to keep walking it, no matter how hard it got. Because this fight was bigger than just her. It was about all of us. And Michelle wasn't going to stop until the world saw that. The weeks after Michelle's explosive interview became a defining moment in the ongoing conversation around race and privilege. Despite the relentless backlash, there was also an unmistakable shift in the air. The media storm that followed her words was not just a fleeting wave. It was the beginning of a reckoning. People from all walks of life began to ask difficult questions, and though many still clung to their defensive attitudes, others began to listen. For Michelle, however, the work had only just begun. The public criticism continued to come in waves, some from those who had always supported her, others from those who now saw her as a threat. It wasn't just strangers on the internet now, it was people within her own circles, colleagues, former allies, even friends. The whispers grew louder, and the social media posts more venomous. But Michelle had never been one to cower in the face of adversity. She had spent her life being underestimated, being told to shrink, and she wasn't about to let the shadows of public scorn silence her now. One evening, after another long day filled with interviews and meetings, Michelle sat in her office at home, her eyes fixed on the computer screen in front of her. She was drafting another op-ed, a deeper reflection on the systemic racism that continued to plague the country. As she typed, her thoughts shifted to a conversation she had overheard a few days ago, at a gathering of activists and political leaders, a conversation that had sparked something inside her. It wasn't the words of the people who were there, but the silent complicity of those who watched. The way they nodded along, the way they didn't challenge the toxic rhetoric, those were the moments that haunted her, the quiet support of a system that perpetuated inequality and division. It wasn't the overt racism that she feared. It was the silent, passive acceptance. The people who could see the cracks and choose to ignore them, or worse, perpetuate them. The conversation was everywhere, in every space Michelle occupied, and it was exhausting. It wasn't just about a single encounter anymore. It wasn't just about one waitress or one cafe. It was about the way systems of privilege operated, silently and without consequence, to keep people of color from achieving what others took for granted. Michelle took a deep breath as she stared at the screen. The words on the page were beginning to take shape. But something inside her urged her to dig deeper, to challenge herself and the world she lived in even more. Her role wasn't just to reflect on the state of things. It was to call out the entrenched systems that allowed this to happen, to put herself at the forefront of a movement that demanded real change. Words alone weren't enough. Action was required. 2 days later, Michelle found herself back at the cafe, the very place where her journey had taken an unexpected turn. The act of revisiting was not out of nostalgia or need for closure. It was a deliberate choice, a way to confront the system head-on. She was no longer the woman who had entered those doors uncertain, unsure of what would happen. She was someone different now, someone who had faced the ugly side of society and emerged unbroken, stronger for it. This time, when she entered, she had a plan, and she wouldn't leave until she had done what needed to be done. As the bell above the door jingled, Michelle stepped inside the cafe, her presence filling the room like a quiet storm. She had come alone, her only company the deep resolve in her chest and the courage in her bones. The usual ambience of the cafe, the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of cups. Everything felt distant to her, like she was in a different world altogether. For a moment, she stood still, taking in the room, trying to gauge if anything had changed since the last time she had been there. The same waitress was behind the counter, though this time her demeanor seemed different. There was a cautiousness to her movements, as though she knew Michelle would be back and wasn't sure what to expect. When their eyes met, the waitress froze. There was no indifference now, no sneer. Just a flicker of something more akin to guilt, or maybe fear. She didn't say anything, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, the weight of the encounter thickening the air between them. Michelle walked up to the counter slowly, her heels clicking on the floor in a rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. She didn't look away as she approached. Her gaze remained fixed on the woman who had once dismissed her so easily. "I think we need to talk," Michelle said, her voice calm, but the steel behind her words clear. The waitress hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked as though she wanted to apologize again, but this time, there was no apology left to give. Michelle had already moved past that. She was here for something deeper now, something more important. "You said a lot of things to me the last time we spoke," Michelle continued, her voice unwavering. "And while I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, I realized that it's not just you. You represent something much bigger. You represent the way this country treats people like me, people who don't look like you, people who are constantly told they don't belong. And I want you to understand that what you did, it wasn't just personal, it was systemic. And that's the real issue here." The waitress opened her mouth again, but this time she managed to speak. "I never meant to." "No," Michelle interrupted, her tone firm. "You didn't mean to, but that's the problem. So many people don't mean to, but they still do it. The systems we live in are built on biases, and those biases don't just go away because you don't acknowledge them. They're reinforced every day, in every look, every word, every action. And you are part of that system." The room fell silent, the other customers oblivious to the tension unfolding. Michelle didn't care. She wasn't here for them. She was here to make sure that this moment counted. She wasn't going to let it pass without leaving a mark. "Do you see now?" Michelle asked, her eyes searching the waitress's face. "Do you see how deep this goes?" The waitress stood frozen, her eyes wide, a mixture of fear and confusion on her face. She looked around, almost as though she were hoping for someone to intervene, for someone to tell her that Michelle was wrong, that this wasn't her fault. But the truth was clear. It was always her fault, and it was always everyone's fault who failed to see the bigger picture. The silence between them was thick. Finally, the waitress spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought of it like that." Michelle nodded slowly. "Most people don't. But that's how systems work. They don't ask you to think. They just ask you to keep going, to stay in line, to not challenge things. They want you to keep your head down and accept the way things are. But that's how things stay the same. That's how racism stays hidden in plain sight." For a long moment, the waitress said nothing. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke again. "What do you want me to do? How can I fix this?" Michelle looked at her for a long time, weighing her options. She could walk away, let it end with this conversation, let the woman sit in her guilt and uncertainty. But Michelle wasn't in the business of letting people off the hook. Not anymore. "I want you to start seeing people," Michelle said, her voice soft but insistent. "Not as stereotypes, not as assumptions, but as human beings. I want you to realize that the way you treat people matters. Every interaction, every word, every glance, it matters." The waitress nodded slowly, her expression pained but sincere. "I will try," she said, almost as if she were convincing herself. "I will try to do better." Michelle didn't know if the waitress would truly change, but she wasn't here for promises. She was here for the truth, and the truth had been spoken, loud and clear. "That's all we can ask for," Michelle said, turning to leave. As she walked out of the cafe, the door chimed behind her, and she didn't look back. She knew that change wasn't instant. It never was. But it had begun. The conversation had started, and now it would have to keep going. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But Michelle knew that the fight for change, for equality, would never be easy. And it would never be quick. But she was ready. She had always been ready. Because no matter how many doors closed, there would always be one more to open. After Michelle's confrontation in the cafe, things had started to shift. Not just in the minds of those around her, but deep within her as well. She had known for years that the fight against racism wasn't one that could be won with a single battle. It wasn't about one conversation, one moment of clarity. It was about the long, exhausting grind. And even now, as she stood at the precipice of something far bigger than she had initially anticipated, the weight of it all still hung heavily on her shoulders. The words, "I will try," from the waitress still echoed in Michelle's mind, but there was a growing doubt in her heart. Trying wasn't enough. Trying didn't change anything. Action, real action, was what mattered. She had said her piece, but Michelle knew that much like the countless other moments of discrimination and bias she had experienced in her life, this too would fade into a distant memory unless something else was done to ensure that people continued to feel the weight of what had been said. That's when she knew. The work wasn't just about personal encounters or spreading awareness. It was about pushing forward a larger systemic change. She couldn't let the conversation stop at one cafe, one op-ed, or one interview. Michelle had a platform, and she was going to use it. She spent the following weeks meeting with activists, community leaders, and educators, all of whom had been working tirelessly to break down the walls of inequality that existed in society. There was a shared sense of urgency among them, but also a shared sense of frustration. Things were changing, but it was happening at a pace that felt agonizingly slow. Despite all the conversations, the movements, the protests, racism was still ingrained in every corner of society. People still saw black and brown faces and assumed inferiority. They still made assumptions based on appearance, and they still held on to the unspoken belief that they were somehow entitled to more than others. Michelle couldn't deny the gnawing feeling in her chest that perhaps she wasn't doing enough, that perhaps all of this was too little, too late. The backlash from her statements still haunted her. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The hate wasn't going away. It had taken root in places that she could never fully reach with words alone. The power structures in place were centuries old, built on assumptions, prejudice, and systemic barriers that didn't just affect those who were targeted, they affected everyone. Her mornings had become a blur of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions with like-minded people who were just as disillusioned as she was with the slow pace of change. She had already spoken out about the microaggressions, the quiet racism that people dismissed as not a big deal. Now she was ready to take on the larger structures that kept racism alive in schools, workplaces, and government policies. It wasn't just the waitress anymore, or the incident at the cafe. It wasn't even just about her own life experiences. This was a war that spanned generations. The systems of privilege didn't just exist in people's attitudes. They existed in the very laws, in the policies, in the corporate structures that allowed wealth and opportunity to be hoarded by a select few, while millions were kept marginalized. Michelle found herself diving deeper into conversations about reparations, education reform, and dismantling police brutality. Each conversation opened her eyes to the ways in which her fight had been limited by the confines of the traditional political structure. She had been working on racial justice in the public sphere, but now she realized how much of that was merely scratching the surface. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Michelle sat alone in her office, reflecting on everything she had learned over the past few months. She had made progress in some areas, but so much of the landscape still felt the same. She had spoken to the media, pushed her message to the public, and shown the world what it looked like to stand up against racism. But the words of her critics, the anger, and the hate still lingered, like a dark cloud hovering over her every move. Her phone buzzed with another angry tweet, another headline that questioned her integrity, another comment that dismissed her fight as irrelevant. It seemed like for every step she took forward, there were always 2 steps back. The loneliness that began to seep into her thoughts reminded Michelle of something important. There was a difference between knowing you are right and feeling like you are winning. The truth was exhausting, and it wasn't enough for her to fight it on her own. But Michelle wasn't one to back down, not even when the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. She knew that this was just one chapter in a much larger story, and if she was going to make a real difference, she needed to get to the heart of the issue. The fact was, society was more than just individuals. It was a collection of systems, institutions, and structures that perpetuated this cycle of inequality. She started planning. It wasn't enough to just be vocal about the problem. She needed to show people how to fix it. She needed to create a space where everyone could see the truth, where every person who had ever turned a blind eye could be forced to confront their own biases, their own complicity. One morning, Michelle met with a team of strategists who had been working on grassroots organizing, figuring out ways to change the very policies that had allowed systemic racism to thrive. As they sat together, Michelle felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. They were talking about real, tangible change, changing school curriculums to reflect true history, reforming the criminal justice system, creating new pathways for economic equity, and fostering communities where diversity wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated. Michelle was ready. She had spent years fighting for what was right, but now it was time to move beyond words and take action. Several months later, Michelle stood at the podium, facing a room filled with influential leaders and activists from across the nation. The press was packed into the back of the room, cameras flashing as she began to speak. Racism is not just a personal failing, it is a systemic injustice that permeates every level of our society, Michelle began, her voice steady and strong. It is embedded in the very systems we operate within, from our schools to our workplaces, to the policies that govern our daily lives. It is no longer enough to simply talk about the problem. We must act. She paused, making sure the weight of her words landed. I've spent a lot of time talking to people, activists, educators, citizens, people who have spent their entire lives trying to push for change. But we can't keep waiting for change to trickle down from the top. It's not going to come. The systems are designed to protect the powerful, to keep those with privilege at the top. We must rise up, demand that these systems be dismantled, and build something new. The room was silent. Michelle could feel the intensity of their gaze, the weight of their attention. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every single person who had been kept down for too long. It was about the millions of people who had been waiting for their voices to be heard, for their stories to be told. We cannot keep pretending that we're making progress when people of color are still disproportionately affected by poverty, unemployment, police brutality, and systemic inequality, she continued. We cannot keep telling ourselves that things are getting better when we have a generation of children who are being taught lies in school, when their history is erased, when their voices are silenced. Her words echoed in the room, stirring something deep within every person listening. They had heard these words before, but they had never heard them from someone so prominent, someone who had the power to bring real, tangible change. Michelle wasn't just calling for a conversation anymore. She was calling for action. We are in a war for justice, a war for equity, a war to ensure that every person in this country has the same opportunities, the same rights, the same ability to succeed, she said, her eyes scanning the room. This is not just about racial equality. It is about the future of this country. It is about building a world where every person is valued, no matter the color of their skin, the shape of their body, the religion they practice, or their gender. And that means breaking down the walls that divide us. As Michelle spoke, the room was no longer filled with silence. There was a quiet murmur, a shift in the air as people began to realize that they were witnessing the beginning of something important, something bigger than they had anticipated. The room was filled with a new kind of energy, one that had been dormant for far too long, one that was about to erupt into action. "I'm ready to lead this charge," Michelle said, her voice resolute. "But I need each and every one of you to stand beside me, because this is not my fight alone. This is all of our fight. We are in this together, and together we will bring the change this country so desperately needs." The room erupted into applause. Michelle stood tall, her heart racing, but her resolve unshaken. This was the moment. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. And for the first time in a long time, Michelle felt hopeful. Not because the road ahead would be easy, but because now she had the strength of a nation behind her. It had been over a year since Michelle had stood before that crowd, her voice unwavering as she called for action, for change, for justice. The movement she had ignited had grown, evolved, and transformed in ways she hadn't even anticipated. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a full-fledged movement that was challenging every institution, every person, every structure that perpetuated inequality. Michelle had always known that the work would never be easy. That's what kept her grounded, focused. But she hadn't anticipated just how deep the resistance would run, how much people were willing to fight to maintain the status quo. The backlash was relentless, but now it wasn't just words on social media. It wasn't just the anonymous trolls or the insults hurled at her during interviews. Now the resistance came from the highest levels of power, from people who had been benefiting from the system of privilege for so long that any attempt to shake it felt like an existential threat to them. She had been the target of smear campaigns, personal attacks, and even threats. But through it all, Michelle remained resolute. She had grown accustomed to the ugliness of public life, to the way people twisted her words, to the way they tried to silence her at every turn. But each time they tried to silence her, she became louder. She became more determined. There were nights when Michelle lay awake, the weight of the battle pressing heavily on her chest. There were moments when the endless tide of negativity and vitriol seemed insurmountable, when she questioned whether it was worth it. It wasn't just the politicians or the media that were attacking her now. It was the deep-seated prejudices of everyday people. the ones who refused to see their own biases, the ones who believed that calling out racism was divisive. And it hurt. It hurt in a way that no political opponent or internet troll ever could. But in those moments of doubt, she would think back to the conversations she had had with those who were touched by the movement. She thought about the young black girl who had written to her, telling her how she had finally found the courage to speak up at school after hearing Michelle's words. She thought about the elderly woman who had shared her experience of being dismissed and ignored for most of her life, who now felt empowered to confront the injustice she had quietly endured. She thought about the countless others who had told her, "I see now. I understand now, and I'm ready to do something about it." And that was the spark that kept her going. The understanding that, while there were those who would resist change at all costs, there were far more who were ready to stand alongside her, to fight for a better future. People from all walks of life had joined the cause. It wasn't just people of color anymore. It was the entire spectrum of humanity. White, black, Latino, Asian, native, queer, straight, old, young. The movement had become a beacon of hope for all those who had been marginalized, and Michelle had become the face of that hope. But there was still work to be done. The political landscape was shifting. New leaders were emerging, ones who were ready to challenge the old guard, ones who were ready to listen. But the road was long and the resistance still ran deep. The system wasn't just going to change overnight, and Michelle knew that. The politicians who had ignored her for years were now starting to take notice. They were listening, yes, but they were also afraid. Afraid of losing their grip on power. Afraid of the revolution that was brewing. But Michelle knew that fear would be the fuel that would propel them forward. One evening, as she sat in her office, preparing for another day of advocacy, she received a call from an unlikely source, an old colleague, someone she had once respected, someone who had publicly criticized her in the past. He had spent years climbing the political ladder, but now he was reaching out to her. Michelle hesitated before picking up the phone. She was used to these calls. People who had once dismissed her, now suddenly wanting to make amends. "Michelle," he said, his voice tentative, almost apologetic. "I've been following what you've been doing, and I can't deny it any longer. You're right. We've been wrong. And I think I can help. We need to push for change from within. We need to use the system to break the system." Michelle listened intently, her heart pounding. She wasn't naive. She knew that the people who had opposed her wouldn't just roll over. But this call, this shift, felt different. It felt like the first crack in the dam. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something that could finally break through the walls that had been built to keep people like her, and so many others, oppressed. After the call ended, Michelle sat there for a long time, staring out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a surge of hope. Real change was possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be immediate, but it was within reach, and she would fight for it, every single day. Months passed, and Michelle's efforts began to bear fruit. Her calls for systemic reform grew louder. She worked with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders to push for policies that would begin to dismantle the systems of oppression. She spoke at rallies, at community gatherings, in boardrooms. She continued to raise her voice, louder, stronger, and more confident with every passing day. But it wasn't just about policy changes. It was about the way people thought, the way they saw each other, the way they understood the world. Michelle knew that until people were ready to look at the systems around them and say, "This is not right," change would remain a distant dream. And so she kept speaking, she kept teaching, she kept pushing. Then, one night, something remarkable happened. A group of activists, people who had once felt invisible, people who had been fighting on the ground for years without recognition, came together to celebrate the progress they had made. Michelle had helped create a platform for their voices, and they were finally being heard. The event was held in a large auditorium, filled with people from all walks of life, Young, old, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, people who had been marginalized, ignored, or silenced. They gathered to honor the work they had done, the changes they had made, and the fight that was still ongoing. Michelle was invited to speak, and when she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. She was no longer just the voice of the movement. She had become its heart, its spirit. I stand here tonight, not as someone who has conquered anything, but as someone who has learned how to fight alongside all of you, Michelle said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I am not here to claim victory. I am here to remind you that this is just the beginning. We have so much more work to do. But together, we will continue to break down these walls. We will continue to tear down the systems that divide us, and we will build a new world, a world where every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The crowd rose to its feet, the applause deafening. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she looked out at the faces of the people who had come together, people who had been fighting for years, people who had stood in the shadows, unheard and unseen. But now, they were no longer silent. They were no longer invisible, and neither was Michelle. The fight wasn't over, but the dawn had finally broken, and for the first time in a long time, Michelle felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. This was the beginning of something new, and together they would change the world. For the first time, Michelle could truly see the future, a future where the walls of racism, oppression, and hatred would crumble. It wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer alone, and neither were they. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your experiences matter, and we truly value each and every one of you. Your voice is important, and your input helps make these conversations meaningful. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed the story. Have a wonderful day, and if you've listened to the end, please leave a comment with the phrase, "We all have a part to play," to let us know you've been with us all the way through. Your support means everything to us.